It is 1935. In the German city of Munich, Adolf Hitler's photographer, Heinrich Hoffmann, seeks the help of a famous doctor known for using unusual methods to treat his high-class Berlin patients. At first, the doctor is reluctant to travel, but when Hitler sends his private plane to Berlin, he acquiesces and over the coming weeks treats Hoffmann for gonorrhea. After telling Hitler that the physician saved his life, Hitler seeks an appointment himself for stomach cramps, which the doctor cures him of with a cocktail of vitamins and probiotics. Grateful for the relief, Hitler insists the man becomes his personal physician, and over the next 10 years, the dictator becomes ever more dependent on him, as the doctor struggles to keep the Führer functional by using ever more powerful and addictive drugs, which over time turn Hitler into an addict and very possibly affect the entire course of World War II. The doctor's name? Theodor Morell, the Führer's personal physician. The man known to history as Theodor Morell was born on the 22nd of July 1886 in the village of Treis-Munzenberg in the Upper Hessen region of west-central Germany, not far north of Frankfurt. Treis lies just outside Munzenberg itself, home to one of Germany's best-preserved castles of the High Middle Ages. His father, Karl, was a primary school teacher, while his mother, Elisa Margareta, came from a quite affluent family of the region. The Morells were comfortable as a result. Theodor had an older brother named Adolf and a younger sister named Emily. Theodor's early years were of very little note. He tried to attend the local primary school in Treis-Munzenberg, but he was afflicted by stomach cramps in his youth and eventually had to be homeschooled. This early experience with ill health probably spurred him towards entering the medical field himself in later years. It also constituted a coincidental link to Adolf Hitler. Years later, when Morell first entered the Nazi dictator's orbit, it was for the purposes of trying to cure him of a stomach ailment he had been suffering from for quite some time. When he began attending secondary school, Theodor shone. At the end of his studies, he was excused having to take an oral examination on the grounds that his performance through the year was so good that he was not required to take the final test. From this, it is evident that he had his choice of what he wanted to study at university. He did not immediately choose medicine. Instead, he headed to the town of Friedberg in the Hessen region to undertake training in a teaching seminary. In those days, a teaching degree did not take that long to acquire once a person had a decent secondary education behind them, and by age 19, Theodor had completed his training. He spent the next year teaching at a school near Mainz. However, that marked the end of his teaching career. By the time the year was done, he had decided to change course and began studying medicine, eventually ending up at Heidelberg University, one of Germany's most prestigious colleges. When he finished there in 1909 at 23 years of age, he was noted as excelling at everything other than chemistry and zoology. Following this, Morell decided to spread his wings a little and went to France, studying at Grenoble and in Paris. Back in Germany, he took various jobs working with an immunologist and in an ear clinic, while working part-time to write up a PhD thesis on gynecology in Munich in Bavaria. Finally, in 1913, he was awarded both his doctorate and his license to work as a physician. It was a reasonably impressive achievement to acquire his license when he was still short of his 27th birthday, and his records show an abundance of complimentary references from those who had worked with him and taught him at various clinics and colleges. Morell's movements over the period that followed are mysterious. he seemingly grew quickly bored of working as a doctor in southern Germany and signed up as a ship's doctor with the Linie that ran ships between Europe and Africa. After a time, he switched to the North German Lloyd Linie Company and undertook some voyages between the port of Hamburg and South America, a popular destination for German emigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Later in life, Morell would claim that some of his more experimental types of medicine and treatments were derived from things that he had come across during his extensive travels beyond Europe. This must have been an exaggeration. He can only have been working for these shipping companies for about 8 or 9 months at the most, and would have had little time to acquire anything other than a passing acquaintance with local folk medicine when he arrived at these African or South American ports. Instead, this appears to have simply been a later effort to lend legitimacy to his often peculiar remedies and tonics. Morell's overseas adventures were quickly brought to an end by the outbreak of the First World War, as the British Royal Navy took command of the Atlantic Ocean. The conflict also saw him conscripted into the German Imperial Army. Morell's background meant that he was enlisted as a medic and served in a field hospital on the Western Front in France in 1917. Towards the end of his service, he was relocated to a prison hospital for POWs in Germany itself and served as a camp physician. Finally, as the war came to an end and Germany descended into revolution, he headed for Berlin, having acquired enough money to purchase a medical practice that was for sale there. Morell's life changed in a very tangible manner soon after the war ended. At this time, he met and soon married Johanna Moller. She was an actress who came from a wealthy family. They would never have children, but Johanna's family wealth provided more than enough funding for Theodor to pursue his interest in experimental medicine. Whether this interest had developed during his year as a ship's doctor is debatable. Ever since modern medicine and pharmacology emerged in the middle of the 19th century, there has always been a strand of alternative medicine right alongside it. Morell became an advocate for it in Berlin in the 1920s and developed his office to have the most cutting-edge medical equipment to impress his patients. Wealthy patients followed, and many were prescribed a peculiar concoction of substances ranging from plants to enzymes to bile. Not all of this was completely bogus. For instance, Morell placed an emphasis on the idea of boosting the immune system through injections or consumption of high doses of vitamins. In the 21st century, when people are used to the idea of taking vitamin supplements on a daily basis, this doesn't seem unusual. Yet in Morell's time, it was a novel idea and had considerable merit, especially if a person had been ill and was vitamin deficient as a result. Whatever the medical merits of the other substances that went along with the vitamins might have been, people seemed convinced. The King of Romania and the Shah of Persia petitioned unsuccessfully for Morell to come work in Bucharest and Tehran as their personal doctor. Actors and singers were amongst his clientele in Berlin, indicating that his wife also had some input into who he treated as well as paying for his lavish lab. It all worked pretty well. By the early 1930s, he was earning about 150,000 Reichsmarks a year, a very prosperous practice. Morell's practice suffered as a result of the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. The economic downturn impacted severely on Germany as it had to maintain its war reparations payments to the British, French, and others, even as it suffered through the crisis. Additionally, it was an elongated crisis in Germany. The first phase of it was followed by a secondary phase that was even worse from the summer of 1931 onwards, after the almost complete collapse of the Credit Anstalt Bank in Vienna, the largest banking house in Central Europe. Financial and economic contagion spread across the continent as a result. These events then facilitated the further rise of extremist political parties like the National Socialist German Workers' Party in Germany. The Nazis were an ultra-nationalist German movement committed to reviving Germany's national strength and creating a racially hierarchical Europe in which the Nordic races ruled and others, such as the Jewish and Slavic people, were either killed or turned into an underclass of workers. There is no evidence that Morell had any special interest in political matters, and his views on many issues remain a mystery to this day. However, he did join the Nazi Party in 1933, after they came to power early that year. There is nothing too unusual in this. Hundreds of thousands of Germans joined the party in the immediate aftermath of Hitler's ascent as German leader. The belief was that joining the party could be a boon to a person's career. In Morell's case, his decision might also have been connected with his past activities. Over the years, many of his patients had been people of Jewish heritage, and there is even a possibility that Morell had some limited Jewish ancestry himself, although this has never been fully substantiated. Whatever the motive, Morell joined the Nazis in 1933, but he did not attempt to engage with the party or move up its hierarchy. Like many other Germans, he did so purely as a precautionary measure. It was better to appear to be an adherent than to come under any suspicion from the new regime. In the spring of 1936, Morell's life changed forever. Through friends of his wife and himself in the German film industry, he was introduced to Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's official photographer. Hoffmann was an alcoholic with a growing accumulation of health problems caused by his drinking habits and obesity related to his consumption of alcohol. Morell was discreet and referred in his notes to Hoffmann suffering from piles, when in reality he may have also been treating him for gonorrhea, a sexually transmitted disease. Hoffmann was already becoming immensely wealthy owing to his profiteering from the distribution of Hitler's image, and paid Morell to come and live in Munich to treat him personally for several weeks. One evening, not long after he began treating Hoffmann, Morell was at a gathering in the photographer's mansion in the Bogenhausen suburb of Munich when he was introduced to Hitler. This initial social meeting soon turned into a professional relationship. Towards the end of Morell's time in Munich treating him, Hoffmann reported to Hitler that he had noticed an improvement in his health. Hitler was sufficiently impressed that he began consulting with Morell himself. At this stage, the dictator of Germany was certainly not in the kind of bad health that would plague him by the final years of his life. Yet he was suffering from a number of ailments already by the mid-1930s, notably stomach cramps, that his other doctors had failed to come up with a solution for, and a severe rash. This was the manner in which Theodor Morell became the personal physician to Adolf Hitler. Morell was not a senior Nazi official of any kind, and we would have very little information concerning his actions and role in the regime had it not been for the fact that Morell kept a diary which was not so much an account of his daily thoughts and actions as it was a careful log of his treatment of Hitler, whom he termed Patient A. In this, he would record his meetings with Hitler, what the Nazi leader's symptoms and ailments were on a given day, and what he gave him to treat the growing array of disorders and issues he suffered from. This diary was not kept from 1936 onwards. Instead, the doctor only began recording these details in a book from August 1941. The cause of this sudden change of habit was Hitler's declining health and a sudden illness that had left him quite debilitated at a very inopportune time during the early stages of the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Evidently, Morell wanted to have a precise account of how he was treating the German dictator. This diary was maintained by Morell for the next 3.5 years, and provides a highly valuable insight into Hitler's declining health and, as we will see, the growing cocktail of drugs and other substances that his doctor was pumping into him. The diary only barely survived. At the end of the war, it was shipped out of Berlin in the middle of several crates of Morell's belongings to a facility at Bad Reichenhall in southern Germany, where a certain Dr. Riedel ran a business on Morell's behalf. The crates were buried next to a wall there in the final stages of the war. They might have stayed in that location if Riedel hadn't decided to reveal their location to some American soldiers in return for immunity from any prosecution for his ties to Hitler's physician. The book was then sent to America and spent 4 decades in storage in Washington, D.C., before finally being published in 1983. Therefore, Morell's revelations have only been widely available since the mid-1980s. The man who Morell would term Patient A was not in dreadfully bad health when Morell first became his doctor in 1936. After all, the Nazi dictator was still only in his mid-40s at that time. He had the usual ailments that one might expect of a middle-aged man, as well as the stomach cramps and the rash. Early on, Morell prescribed him some probiotics and other tonics that he had devised. The stomach cramps were relieved and the rash on his leg cleared up. Whether this was a complete coincidence or not is unclear. A probiotic can help to clear up a rash. Morell's use of it to do so was pretty novel for the time, and this added to Hitler's sense that his new doctor was a capable physician, better than his other ones who favored more traditional methods. Beyond this, Hitler was also something of a hypochondriac, with unusual habits himself, so Morell's approach towards medicine would have complemented Hitler's own view of these things. At least this was the case early on. The problem was that Hitler's health began declining right around the time Morell first entered his orbit. There is no one clear answer as to what ailed him. He was most likely suffering from Parkinson's disease, something which explains the hand tremor he developed, which got worse as the years went by. This could also be explained by Huntington's disease. Another theory speculates that he suffered from syphilis, although there is no concrete evidence for this. Parkinson's is the most likely explanation, and this was soon compounded by other issues that developed after the outbreak of the Second World War. As time went by, his deteriorating health would see Hitler place more and more faith in Morell. However, Morell's treatments would make his health problems worse over time, as he was effectively drugging Hitler rather than treating his underlying conditions. Morell was not Hitler's only doctor. As his health problems increased over the years, he recruited a team of physicians who tried different approaches. The most prominent of these was Karl Brandt, a young doctor who had studied under numerous well-known physicians and surgeons and who was then hired by Hitler in 1934 as his personal doctor, having first met him in 1932. Brandt was only 30 years old when he joined Hitler's staff. Morell and he clashed instantly. Morell viewed Brandt as a young upstart, while Brandt was one of the first to suspect that Morell's alternative treatments were not just ineffective, but possibly harmful. He also questioned Morell's ideological loyalty. Brandt was a committed Nazi who had joined the party before the Nazis seized power and who would later become involved in the Aktion T4 program, a campaign of involuntary mass euthanasia in German hospitals and prisons based out of Tiergartenstrasse 4 in central Berlin. Brandt was responsible for a surgeon, Hans-Karl von Hasselbach, also contributing intermittently to Hitler's medical team. Another doctor of Hitler's later on was Erwin Giesing. Like Brandt, he was considerably younger than Morell. Giesing was an ear, nose and throat specialist, one who also joined the Nazi Party in 1932. He occasionally treated Hitler for specific ailments and would be called upon frequently years later when Hitler suffered ear and eye injuries towards the end of the war. Unlike Brandt, Giesing did share one feature with Morell. Like the older doctor, Giesing was a great believer in the efficacy of Class A drugs for treating a range of ailments. This was not entirely out of the ordinary. Certain narcotics are still widely used in medical settings today as local anesthetics, particularly in ear, nose and throat surgery. Both Giesing and Morell would administer growing amounts of drugs to Hitler as the war went on. For his part, patient A liked it. He remarked on occasion that the drugs had worked very well. The doctors would continue to administer them when there was little medical need. As Morell was seemingly able to treat Hitler's ailments effectively, and he won his trust, a friendship started to develop between the pair. Hitler liked Morell's company, though most of the other leading Nazis found his presence in the Führer's inner circle perplexing. The dictator would often visit the Morell household in Berlin, occasionally appearing unexpectedly for Sunday tea before the war began, when this was still possible. Even after Europe was at war, he did so once or twice. When Theodor's wife could only rustle up some spaghetti and cheese, Hitler ordered his assistant to provide them with ration coupons. It was a peculiar exchange, as the Morells hardly needed them. By that time, Theodor was a millionaire in modern terms due to his exploiting his ties to the Nazi leadership. Hitler enjoyed Frau Morell's almond cakes and would request them on occasion. This close relationship extended to Theodor regularly being seen in the background of the photographs which Hoffmann, who had introduced the pair years earlier, would take regularly of Hitler. As time went by, the doctor became a near perennial presence at Hitler's side. Few individuals spent more time in close proximity to him. This became troublesome for Morell in some ways, as it would require him to regularly travel. For instance, he spent a lot of the 3 years between the summer of 1941 and the summer of 1944 on the Eastern Front in the Lair headquarters, with Hitler and his military staff. Very often, he was one of the attendees at late-night gatherings where Hitler, who stayed awake often until dawn and rose around midday, would drone on into the early hours about trains and other random topics. Much of this lay years ahead, once the Second World War was well underway. Morell played a peculiar role in the process whereby Hitler and the Nazis pulled the continent towards war in 1938 and 1939. The Anschluss with Austria was completed in March 1938. Hitler immediately turned his attention to Czechoslovakia. This country had been formed following the end of the First World War and included the Sudetenland, an area populated by German-speaking people of largely Germanic ethnicity in Czechoslovakia. He prevailed on Britain, France and Italy for Germany to be allowed to annex the Sudetenland at the Munich Conference in September 1938. This just proved a stepping stone to full incorporation of the country into the Third Reich, and in March 1939, Germany prepared to invade Czechoslovakia. With German army divisions massing on the border, Slovakia and Ruthenia ceded from their union with the Czech parts of the country and made it known that they would accept German rule. In response, the president of Czechoslovakia, Emil Hácha, flew to Berlin to negotiate with Hitler. During several meetings there on the 14th of March 1939, with the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, the head of the Air Force Hermann Göring, and with Hitler himself, Hácha was threatened with invasion if he did not agree to his country being annexed. Göring claimed that he would bomb Prague to the ground if Hácha didn't capitulate, while Hácha was even chased around a table with the papers signing away Czechoslovakia's independence being waved at him to sign. The Czech president, who was in his mid-60s, suffered what was probably a heart attack in the process. In response, Morell was called in to inject him with some stimulants. With the doctor's drugs entering his system, Hácha was sufficiently revived to be able to sign the papers. German forces entered Czechoslovakia the next day. The Hácha incident highlights how Morell was a kind of physician on demand within the Nazi leadership. Though his position might best be described as the personal doctor to Hitler himself, and he stopped running his private practice in Berlin for the most part after he was employed by the leader, he did see other patients within the upper echelons of the Nazi party and government. Interestingly, these were often situations where various Nazi ministers and officials were advised by Hitler to see Morell about one health issue or another. It's revelatory that nearly all of the individuals who went to see Morell in this capacity formed a very negative impression of him. Göring disparagingly called him the Meister Jabber on account of Morell's solution for every ailment being to inject the patient with one thing or another. Not long after he started attending to Hitler's health issues, Morell was visited by Albert Speer, the Nazi architect who later became the Minister for the War Economy. Speer was suffering from gastrointestinal issues, and Hitler recommended that he visit Morell. There he was prescribed some of the doctor's bizarre tablets, which included a cocktail of vitamins, hormones, bile and intestinal bacteria. Suspecting that something was amiss, Speer went to a specialist for another opinion, who advised him that he just needed to get some rest. Speer's symptoms soon abated without Morell's pills. Later, the list of those who viewed Morell as a quack grew. Still, almost everyone who Hitler recommended the doctor to appeased the Führer by meeting with him. These included the propaganda minister, Josef Goebbels, von Ribbentrop and many others. Morell even treated Neville Chamberlain for flu symptoms at the Munich conference in 1938 and tended to the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini during another diplomatic conference. Things changed for Morell, as it did for so many other Germans and Europeans, in the autumn of 1939. After Hitler and the Nazis had pressured Hácha to allow Czechoslovakia to be annexed into the Reich, the German leadership immediately turned their attentions eastwards to Poland. Large portions of the country had been controlled by Germany prior to defeat in the First World War, and the peace terms from that war had ensured that East Prussia, a part of Germany, was geographically cut off from the rest of the country by the Danzig corridor of Polish land. This and other claims were the basis for German calls for Poland to cede territory. By then, Britain and France were no longer engaging in diplomacy with Hitler and instead were trying to rearm and mobilize before the inevitable war. When Poland was invaded on the 1st of September 1939, the British and French responded by declaring war on Germany. The conflict would drive Morell closer to Hitler as the Nazi leader's health declined during the course of it, and he became ever more dependent on Morell, much to his detriment, as we will see. Meanwhile, Morell's own health was declining. While at a dinner party in the first winter of the war, he suffered what was probably a heart attack and fell over, hitting his head on some furniture. These coronary issues were exacerbated by his obesity, and they got worse as the war went on. By 1942, he was suffering from regular attacks of angina. On one or two occasions, he was so incapacitated by these chest spasms that he had to have his assistant doctor attend to Hitler, although he tried where possible to disguise his own health problems. The war also provided an opportunity for Morell to make a lot of money. There were many figures moving within Hitler's inner circle who were able to exploit their proximity to the Führer to make money. Heinrich Hoffmann, for instance, the photographer through whom Morell had first met Hitler, had a virtual monopoly on reproducing the Nazi leader's image and licensed it to produce everything from postage stamps to postcards. He became a millionaire in modern terms in the process. Morell did something similar. The place of trust he held amongst Hitler's medical team meant that he was able to convince the Führer that he should be given contracts to supply the German army and wider society with some of his potions and pills. Several of these were actually ahead of their time. Mutterflor was a substance that contained live bacteria of the kind found in many health drinks today, but which were rare when Morell began selling them. Others were much more nefarious. One of these was vitamultin, a mix of vitamins, glucose, and, depending on the version of it being administered, methamphetamine. Admittedly, the methamphetamine was derived from another drug which was being distributed to the German army during the war, Pervitin. Pervitin was basically methamphetamine in a pill. There was little disguising this, and much of the German blitzkrieg of the early years of the war was achieved through drug use, as soldiers in tank divisions stayed awake for days at a time on the narcotic. Morell was simply including in vitamultin the substance that was already available in pharmacies, trademarked as Pervitin in Germany. Many people liked it, and Morell started making a lot of money. One estimate is that he made around 6 million Reichsmarks, a sum that made him a multi-millionaire in modern times. The drug had some peculiar fans. Marshal Ion Antonescu, the dictator of Romania, tried it once and wrote to Morell requesting that he send him more of it. In both his case and Hitler's, it's debatable if they actually knew what they were taking. As the war went on and his business empire expanded, Morell was increasingly mobile. For the first 3 years that he served as Hitler's physician, he had split his time broadly between Berlin and Bavaria, where Hitler often spent time in Munich and at his alpine retreat in the mountains near the border of Austria. Once the war started, his habits changed and he traveled quite a lot. In October 1939, after the conquest of Poland was completed, he visited Warsaw to review the troops and for a victory parade. In the summer of 1940, he embarked on a victory visit to Paris after the fall of France, and 4 months later he headed to the far south of the country to hold a diplomatic meeting with General Francisco Franco of Spain. In 1941, he was in Croatia and also visited the front in Ukraine and Latvia. Morell was generally always close by, ready to provide him with whatever drugs might be needed. The war on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union from June 1941 lent some stability to the situation. Hitler had ordered the establishment of a bomb-proof headquarters in the forests near Gierłosz in Poland, which would act as his base of operations, being closer to the front lines than Berlin. He moved in here with a small army of officials as Operation Barbarossa began against the Soviets in Eastern Europe. Morell spent much of his life between the summer of 1941 and late 1944 living here. His quarters were about 250 yards away from Hitler's. Only Hitler's personal secretary, Martin Bormann, was closer, while Morell was notably housed alongside generals and senior military men like Göring and the head of the Wehrmacht, Wilhelm Keitel, a sign of how close by Hitler wanted him to be. As the war went on, Morell resorted to an ever larger number of pills to treat Hitler and also a worrying number of injections. Many of the substances reflected the fact that Morell was something of a quack doctor and for many years had sold remedies that had no scientific basis in medicine. One of these was a concoction that he called Euflat. This was a mix of bile, extract, caffeine, various aloes, pancreatin, and Radix angelica, a dried root used in traditional Chinese medicine. Others involved high doses of vitamins. These were on the more benign end of Morell's medicines. The vitamins and caffeine, for instance, would have at least ensured that Hitler did not have any vitamin deficiencies and was more alert. Others were very peculiar. Morell gave Hitler a substance called orchikrin, a strange mix of bovine testosterone, glycerol phosphates, and pituitary gland made into a tonic. As unpleasant as things like this sound, there is nothing to suggest that they would have had a negative impact on Hitler's health by consuming them. The same cannot be said of the harder narcotics that Morell was giving Hitler more frequently in the early 1940s. These included amphetamines such as Pervitin, or in the form of his own Vitamultin. Morell also commonly prescribed Hitler other Class A drugs, something which was justified initially to treat an ocular issue patient A had with his eyes. It escalated, and soon Morell was administering them regularly. We might assume that Hitler was aware that these drugs were having an impact on him, but he seems to have overlooked the narcotic effect, as Morell's injections and pills gave him the energy he needed to be able to work long days throughout the war. At night, Morell would then administer sleeping pills and tranquilizers so that Hitler could sleep. The late-night round tables, where Hitler would talk at length about random subjects to a group of followers until nearly dawn, can be viewed in fresh perspective when we consider that he was probably high and then experiencing the sedative qualities of the sleeping pills. In the early summer of 1942, Morell played a role in the most high-profile assassination of a senior Nazi to take place during the entirety of the Second World War. The person in question was Reinhard Heydrich. He had worked his way up through the SS and the SD, the Reich security services, in the mid-1930s, eventually becoming the de facto second-in-command of the SS under Heinrich Himmler and overseeing a huge proportion of the Reich security and police services. He had operational oversight for organizing large parts of the Holocaust too. In the autumn of 1941, Hitler had appointed him as the interim protector or governor of Bohemia and Moravia, the rump-occupied state of Czechoslovakia. Heinrich's conduct there was controversial, engaging in a crackdown on Czech resistance groups. This earned him widespread enmity, and on the 27th of May 1942, while driving in an open-top car near Prague, he was attacked and badly wounded by a couple of Czech resistance fighters. He wasn't killed though, and was taken to Bulovka Hospital in Prague, where emergency surgery was carried out. He remained in a critical condition for days thereafter, and this is when Morell was flown in to consult with several other doctors there on Hitler's orders. While Morell's methods and conduct as a physician are otherwise open to question in almost everything else that he did, in the case of Heydrich, he seems to have offered some good advice. He proposed giving Heydrich sulfanilamide, an antibacterial drug which was relatively new at the time. The other physicians at the hospital did not heed his advice. The suspicion later was that the possible onset of gangrene contributed to Heydrich's eventual death on the 4th of June, though the gunshot wounds were paramount. Heydrich's demise was symptomatic of the wider shift in the war in 1942. The German onslaught on the Soviet Union in the late summer and autumn of 1941 was every bit as swift and brutal as it had been in Western Europe a year earlier. In the first weeks of Operation Barbarossa alone, hundreds of kilometers of territory were conquered all along the front. But the distance from Germany to Paris was one thing. Maintaining the speed of the German blitzkrieg from Poland to Moscow was something else entirely. Eventually, the German advance slowed and then stalled short of Moscow and Leningrad in the early winter. Not long after, the Americans entered the war, and it became a grind on the Eastern Front to see if the Germans could simply wear the Russians down in 1942. They didn't, and soon counterattacks were being planned for 1943. As the war shifted dramatically, and it became clear that the Germans were now in dire trouble, Hitler's health deteriorated and Morell increased his injections. One entry from Morell's diary is instructive. On the 24th of March 1943, they were at the Berghof Alpine retreat when Hitler called Morell to him at about 9:30 p.m. He took his blood pressure, which was an extremely high 170 on the systolic pressure. Morell put an exclamation mark after this to indicate that he was shocked. Although Hitler consistently had abnormally elevated blood pressure by that time. Having taken the blood pressure, the doctor gave patient A, quote, 2 intravenous shots of 10 cc septoiod and 2 tablespoons of bromnervacid and an optalidon tablet. The injections of septoiod were a mixture of glucose and iodine. The optalidon was basically caffeine and paracetamol. However, when Morell noted this in his diary, it usually meant it was after giving Hitler Vitamultin as well, which contained methamphetamine. Then, to counteract the amphetamine, glucose and caffeine, the bromnervacid was essentially a strong tranquilizer. A novel element crept into Morell's treatment of Hitler not long after this. Hitler was suffering from acute gastrointestinal issues in the summer of 1943. Most responsible physicians might consider that the often bizarre cocktail of enzymes, bile, hormones, glucose, methamphetamine, and dozens of other substances which Morell was giving him might have been causing the issue and might have advised cutting back. For Morell, the solution was adding something new into the mix. In his entry for the 18th of July 1943 in the diary, he noted that he, quote, injected eupavarin intravenously and Eucadal subcutaneously, gave him Euflat and Luitzheim, stomach massage and diet, spastic constipation with violent pain and a lot of intestinal gas. Several of these things were Morell's concoctions. The Luitzheim, for instance, consisted of enzymes, amylase and proteases. But the Eucadal is quite significant. This was a powerful opiate. Today it is notoriously known as oxycodone. Long before it was marketed as OxyContin, oxycodone had first been synthesized by doctors at the University of Frankfurt in 1916. The version Morell gave Hitler in the summer of 1943 was mixed with ephedrine and scopolamine, the latter being an alkaloid used to treat motion sickness. Evidently, it was effective, as Morell resorted to it with greater frequency in the months that followed. The motives for resorting to this powerful opiate were often pretty flimsy. On the 9th of January 1944, he gave patient A an injection of Eucadal, quote, because of flatulence caused by worry. All of these injections, whether they were of Eucadal or the many other narcotics and substances Morell administered, were beginning to take a toll on the Nazi leader's circulatory system too. There are entries in which he notes that Hitler's veins were bleeding, and one entry concerning Eucadal notes that he injected him in the stomach. By 1943, many people who saw Hitler on a regular basis at the Wolf's Lair or in Berlin, and who had noticed his physical decline over the years, were concerned about Morell's methods of treating him. One senior minister decided to confront Morell directly. In the summer of 1943, the foreign minister, Joachim von Ribbentrop, invited Morell to lunch. The pair were hardly friends, and Morell was suspicious as to what the invitation was about. They sat through lunch, and it was only after they had eaten that von Ribbentrop revealed why he had wished to meet Morell. He was concerned about the way in which Hitler was being treated by Morell. What, von Ribbentrop asked him, was in these mysterious injections that he regularly gave the Nazi leader? It was surely more than glucose and vitamins, as Morell would often suggest to those familiar with the fact he regularly injected Hitler. Morell, who was aware that he enjoyed Hitler's confidence more than von Ribbentrop did, answered evasively that he simply gave Hitler what he needed on a given day. He left shortly afterwards. There was a peculiar element to this. Von Ribbentrop was himself treated, along with Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS paramilitary organization, by Felix Kersten, a faith healer whose methods were just as dubious as Morell's. There is no doubt, though, that von Ribbentrop had seen through Morell, and unlike so many others who moved in Hitler's inner circle, was willing to confront the doctor by the summer of 1943 about his methods. The intervention had no tangible impact, though Morell was rattled enough by the confrontation that he wrote a detailed account of it. Far from leading to any decline in Morell's influence, 1944 saw Morell reach the peak of his hold over Hitler. The leader of the Nazi state was in a very bad way. It was as though his physical state reflected the declining German war effort. As news of fresh defeats by the Soviets on the Eastern Front continued through 1943 and 1944, and then word arrived of the opening of a southern front in Sicily in the summer of 1943, followed by the D-Day landings in France a year later, Hitler became more and more ill, his hands shaking and his frame stooped. A large number of German politicians and military commanders kept detailed diaries during the years, and several of them recorded being shocked at Hitler's physical decline during this period, especially if they had not seen him for several months. All of this was compounded by the events of the 20th of July 1944. A group of army officers, led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, conspired to place a briefcase full of explosives near Hitler during a meeting at the Wolf's Lair, and had then planned to seize control of the government once the Führer was dead. The explosives did detonate, but the briefcase had been moved and did not explode where it should. Several people were killed. Hitler was only wounded, but he did suffer increased health complications in the weeks that followed. His trusty Dr. Morell, of course, had the solution: more drugs. There was a notable increase in Morell's prescriptions at this point, particularly of Eucadal. Additionally, there seems to have been an issue of double prescription as well. Morell was giving Hitler strong narcotics to deal with his injuries at the same time that one of his other physicians, Giesing, was also administering Class A drugs. There's no doubt that there was a substantial amount of these drugs being administered. On the 30th of October 1944, Morell noted in his diary that he had given Hitler an injection of Eucadal, which he noted, quote, was by no means easy because of the many recent needle scars. Right around this time, Morell's methods were called into question again. Dr. Erwin Giesing was only an occasional member of Hitler's medical team. He was present at the Wolf's Lair for a more extended period of time following the 20th of July plot due to the injuries Hitler sustained during it. In the weeks that followed, he became suspicious of Morell's methods and eventually obtained some of the pills which he was giving Hitler for his gastrointestinal problems. He discovered that there was strychnine present in these. Today, this is used as a pesticide and is understood to be highly toxic for humans, causing a form of poisoning and muscular contractions. It was used in the early 20th century in very small doses as a performance enhancer, as it stimulated muscles. By the time of the Second World War, it was well known that it was toxic. The amount Morell was administering was small, but the frequency with which he gave these pills to Hitler was such that it would have built up in his system. Accordingly, Giesing and several others confronted Morell and brought this to Hitler's attention. When they did, the dictator responded violently and had Giesing, von Hasselbach and Brandt dismissed. Hitler's response, if Morell's diary is to be believed, indicates the striking manner in which patient A was beholden to Morell. After the effort to bring him down had failed, Hitler said to Morell of the other doctors, "The idiots never paused for a moment to think of the harm they would have been doing to me. I would have found myself all of a sudden without a doctor. and these people ought to realize that you have saved my life several times in the 8 years you have been with me. Look how I was before. Every single one of the doctors who was dragged in failed." When commending Morell's treatment of him, Hitler went on to say that if they both survived the war, he would reward him handsomely afterwards. This was ironic. The diary entry is under the 8th of November 1944. Right after this, Morell took leave to go back to Germany for his brother Adolf's funeral. When he returned to the Wolf's Lair, he met with Hitler and found him extremely irritable and impatient with him, noting in his diary that he had never been spoken to by him in the same way in the 8 years he had been treating him. Hitler's irritability was undoubtedly owing to the military situation. Already by the summer of 1944, the Soviets had been advancing all along the Eastern Front. In some locations, such as south of Leningrad into Estonia, the progress was very slow. But in Ukraine, they were advancing at great speed, and by the autumn of 1944 were pushing into the Balkans. Then the D-Day landings took place in northern France in the summer of 1944, and suddenly the Nazis had to contend with 3 different fronts, one in Eastern Europe, one in Western Europe, and one that had already been opened in Italy in the autumn of 1943. Then Hitler took the decision to launch a last-ditch counteroffensive against the Western Allies in the Ardennes forest around Luxembourg in the winter of 1944. With troops being pulled away from the Eastern Front, the Soviet advance accelerated again into Poland. By November 1944, consideration was being given to when Hitler and his staff would leave the Wolf's Lair and head to Berlin. Although the headquarters would not be fully abandoned until January 1945, Hitler, Morell and the core staff around the Nazi leader left on the 20th of November 1944. Henceforth they would be based out of the Reich Chancellery offices in central Berlin. Life in the Reich Chancellery and surrounding buildings in central Berlin had a strange feel to it in the months that followed. Everyone knew that the war was over and that defeat was imminent. The only hope that Hitler and the other Nazi leaders were clinging to was that as victory neared, the Americans, British and other Western allies would suddenly shift to realizing that the Soviets were a much graver threat to them and would seek to ally with the Nazis. When this did not materialize, Hitler became more and more pensive, according to Morell. The doctor continued to administer his injections to patient A, though by then there were supply shortages creeping into every aspect of life in what remained of the Third Reich, and there was a slight shift in what Morell was administering, notably an increase in the amount of calcium he was prescribing. Morell's own health was also declining steadily at this point. At one point, he botched giving himself an injection and was laid up in bed for several days. His reflections on Hitler on the 23rd of March 1945 described someone whose health was nearly as poor as the Reich that was crumbling around him. He stated, quote, "Slight conjunctivitis in eyes, probably caused by the dust blowing around, as there is a lot of debris from buildings in the courtyard." The Führer declared that he had only very limited vision with the right eye anyway. His left hand is somewhat swollen, perhaps because of the trembling motions. There also are swellings on left ankle and part of the lower left leg. The circumference of the lower left leg was about an inch more than the right. I applied eye drops of cocaine suprarenin solution and forbade him to read. Midday injected strofantin and Benerva Forte intravenously, plus Omnidin and electrotherapy of the left forearm. The Battle of Berlin began in mid-April 1945. In many ways, it had been underway for weeks as the Soviet Red Army moved into position around the capital of the Third Reich, encircling it and preparing for the final assault. It was only in the late spring that the Russians began tightening the noose on the city. Ironically, the strategy of encirclement was one that had been used with devastating effect by the German Wehrmacht against the Red Army in Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia in the first months of the invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Now it was to be used in the final act of the war. In the Chancellery bunker in the center of the city, Hitler was becoming more and more unhinged as the fight for the city began. He turned to blaming the generals for Germany's losses to an even greater extent than he had in years gone by. On the 23rd of April, he dismissed Hermann Göring from his position as the second in command of the Reich via telegram. He also ordered the arrest of Heinrich Himmler a few days later when he learned that he had been negotiating potential surrender terms to the Western Allies through intermediaries in neutral Sweden and elsewhere. Morell was not spared Hitler's wrath either. Patient A had finally lost his patience on the night of the 21st of April 1945. As Morell noted in his diary, that evening he had gone to give Hitler, who was extremely agitated, an injection of glucose. Hitler had responded violently, telling the doctor that he knew that he was drugging him with morphine and threatened to have Morell shot. Morell apparently pleaded on his knees before Hitler, who then dismissed him, telling him to go home and take off his military uniform. He never wanted to see him again. Morell left at that point. The Nazi leader was a physical wreck by then, with other visitors to the bunker in the days that followed later recollecting that he was only half able to walk, had a constant shake to his hands, and seemed like an old man, despite still only being in his mid-50s. It is probable that there were still narcotics left behind by Morell, that he continued to take them in his final days before he took his own life on the 30th of April. Morell did not remain in Berlin to be captured by the Soviets. Many senior Nazis and figures associated with the regime were able to board flights to get out of the capital and fly to elsewhere in Germany in the dying days of the Third Reich. A large proportion of these were heading for the German-Danish border, where a kind of pseudo-government in exile was being formed at the town of Flensburg, one that would surrender to the Western Allies rather than the Soviets. Morell did not join them. He had no reason to. Now that he had been dismissed by Hitler, he really had no place of any kind in the regime. Instead, he flew out of Berlin in the early hours of the 23rd of April, passing over the Russian lines on the way to Munich. As the plane he was on passed in the skies over Bavaria, Russian soldiers gave way to American and British ones. He landed in Munich and was quickly taken ill, his own health being nearly as bad as that of patient A when he had left him in the bunker in Berlin. He was confined to a hospital in Bad Reichenhall when the Western Allies overran the region in the first days of May. He was still bedridden there when he was finally visited by American soldiers and questioned on the 18th of May. Some of those who interrogated him then and in the weeks that followed reported on his terrible hygiene and the fact that Morell seemed to barely be sensible, as though his mind was gone. He was soon transferred, like many suspected Nazi criminals, in southern Germany to Dachau concentration camp, south of Munich, one that had been opened all the way back in 1933. Morell would be questioned here for some time. The issue when it came to Morell was that the Allies really did not have anything to charge him with. Yes, Morell had been Hitler's physician, and he was high up in the Nazi inner circle as a consequence, but he had not held an official government position, and there was nothing to really tie him to the kinds of crimes which the Allies were looking to prosecute in the aftermath of the war. It was not for the want of trying. In December 1946, once the trial of the main Nazi leaders had concluded at Nuremberg, the doctors' trial commenced. A trial of 23 doctors who had been involved in carrying out horrendous experiments at the death camps and other crimes of that nature. Morell's nemesis, Karl Brandt, was included amongst the defendants in the doctors' trial, and he would be found guilty of 3 charges and executed in 1948. Morell, though, was not included in the trial. Part of the reason why he was not charged with any crime was that he was in such a terrible physical condition that he was expected to die soon anyway. He spent the 3 years after the war being transferred between prison hospitals, eventually ending up at Tegernsee Hospital in the summer of 1947. By that time, he could barely be communicated with, interviews resulting in half mumbles. The prosecutors in the doctor's trial even had to abandon plans to have him testify as part of the trial, as it was assumed that there would be no benefit to having him questioned on the stand. He eventually died in the hospital in Tegernsee on the 26th of May 1948 at 61 years of age. Though there were some newspaper reports on him in the immediate aftermath of the war, and a casual awareness that Morell's methods had been unorthodox, the full nature of his approach to treating Hitler's many maladies has only become apparent to historians in the last few decades. Theodor Morell's role in the Third Reich and in managing Hitler's declining health was underappreciated for almost a half a century after the Second World War. The publication of his diary in the 1980s and several recent books on both him and the use of drugs in the Third Reich more broadly have retrieved his story. It is an important one. For much of his life, he was a non-entity, a quack doctor who acquired a certain amount of wealth through his marriage and by peddling many different alternative medicines. All of that changed in 1936 after Heinrich Hoffmann became his patient. Morell apparently managed to treat Hoffmann effectively for some ailments, and during the course of doing so, he met Adolf Hitler. Impressed by his success with Hoffmann, Hitler employed Morell to see if he could fix a stomach issue and a rash which had been plaguing him for a while and which his other doctors had failed to remedy. Morell was successful in treating these initial problems of Hitler's, and this was the key to his promotion thereafter. Hitler, who was an eccentric when it came to his health and habits, now employed Morell as his personal physician, despite Morell's use of peculiar cocktails of vitamins and less conventional substances like pig's blood and hormones. Things started to go downhill in the years that followed, even as Morell became rich selling his medicines to the wider German public. As Hitler's list of quite serious health problems grew, Morell began injecting him and prescribing pills with an ever higher number of substances. Several of these were strange yet benign. However, mixed in with the peculiar potions and pills was a growing amount of various narcotics, sleeping pills and tranquilizers. By the end of the war, based on Morell's treatment, Hitler, or Patient A as Morell termed him in his diary, was probably dependent on the narcotics Morell gave him. Perhaps the steady flow of uppers and downers was partly responsible for his increasingly erratic behavior in the final years of the war. Many Nazis high up in the regime certainly thought so and confronted Morell about his methods. In the end, Hitler only realized in the final days of the Third Reich in the bunker in Berlin that Morell was doing much more harm than good. He would not long survive the war himself, accounts recording that prior to his death in 1948, Morell cut a pathetic figure, grossly obese, with his mind largely gone. What do you think of Theodor Morell? Was he responsible for turning Hitler into a drug addict, or was it possible that Hitler's medical conditions were so serious and numerous that most physicians would have prescribed him strong opiates and other drugs as well under the circumstances? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.